My name is Danielle Knapp. I'm the McCosh Associate Curator here at the JSMA, and thank you for joining us this evening for our presentation on the rich history of sculpture in our state. It is our pleasure to have over 35 works of art by artists from the Northwest currently on view in our Schnitzer Gallery, on view through September in our exhibition, Shaping the Collection. This is an exhibition that highlights acquisitions and donors and collecting interests that have contributed to 50 years of acquiring sculpture by Northwest artists here at our museum. And among the works on view are donations from the Virginia Hazeltine Collection of Pacific Northwest Art, gifts from artists, recent Oregon Arts Commission grant-funded purchases, and artworks that came to us by a variety of means. We're so happy to have Ken O'Connell, an artist, author, scholar, teacher, and a friend of the museum here tonight to present on those artists who lived and worked in our state. Ken is Professor Emeritus of Art here at the UO, where he was a long-time head of the department. His knowledge of the history of these artists and the traditions in our state and his friendships and working relationships with artists make him especially well-suited to share that history with us in this presentation. So we're very happy to have him spend his time with us tonight providing that. And just a few programming notes of things that may be of interest I want to make sure are on your calendar if you're interested. This coming Saturday, February 26th at 2 p.m., we'll have a panel discussion, Journalism Today, here at the museum in conjunction with our Brian Lanker retrospective exhibition. On Monday, February 29th at 6 p.m., so we don't always have Monday night programs, so that's an odd day to make a note of. We'll have a program on art and taxes. And then looking ahead, in April 2nd, we'll have our inaugural David McCosh Memorial Endowment Lecture Series begin with our guest speaker, Bonnie Lang Malcolmson, who's the curator of Northwest Art at the Portland Art Museum, who will be speaking on the influence of white writing in the Northwest School in Oregon. So a topic that I've never heard presented in that way before. We're very excited that she's putting together research to kick off that program on April 2nd. So we hope to see you at those programs and at our other programs that can be found in our spring calendar of events. If you don't yet have one of these, you can grab one on your way out and see what you might want to come to. But in the meantime, Ken, we're so happy to have you here, and thank you so much. And please, everyone, help me welcome Ken to the podium.
Thank you. The museum is open late on Wednesday, so tonight after this slideshow, you're welcome to go through the museum and see firsthand some of these works. Did I put the microphone on where you can hear it okay back there? Yes, you want it up? Oh, it's okay. Good, good. Okay, well, I promise not to use this laser pointer too much because last time I made people a little bit dizzy by moving it around.
I do have to adjust the lapel. Can I get the receiver?
The box? Yes,
Yep.
Here it is.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Should give that a shot.
Yeah, give that a try. I can, if you want me to talk a little louder or forceful, I can. I gave a talk here about a year ago on 100 years of the U of O art faculty and as well as architecture and visitors. And I've given that talk actually 12 times since then, up in Portland and in Salem and actually at the Watershed Gallery. And so this is sort of a focus just on sculpture, and in particular the sculpture show that's up there in the gallery. And these are the people that I'll talk about, and I'll talk about a few others. So in fact, in the research for that talk last year, I ran across this fellow, Roswell Dosh, and this is a picture of him. I just got this last week from his, I think it was his nephew sent me. This is Roswell, his mother, and his sister when they went to Rome in 1908 to 1910. His father was an officer in the Civil War and later got very involved in organizing things in Oregon and Washington. And during 1908 to 1910, he was in charge of developing the Yukon-Alaska Exposition up in Seattle, which was a major event, and it formed 11 buildings that became the basis for the University of Washington. So it was a very important thing. But during that time, he sent his son and daughter and a wife off to Rome, where Roswell, who had already had this strong interest in sculpture, got to meet Rodin and Rodin's assistant. And this is a sculpture by Rodin's assistant of Roswell. Now, this is Roswell as he was pictured at that time, and some of the work that he did. In fact, the U of O Museum owns some of his pieces. And he was born in 1889, studied in Paris, was hired in 1915 to teach at U of O. In 1918, he was the first faculty drafted into World War I. In 1918, he was assigned to military. He was sent down to Presidio, where he was trained, had officers training. He was sent back to Oregon and became a military faculty at Reed College. And in 1918, he catches the worldwide influenza phenomenon and dies at age 29. Kind of a tragic sort of a beginning to this promising career. But it's sort of long lost in our history. And so I've been sort of trying to find these people. Now, another early fellow was Vord Fairbanks, who came to the U of O to teach sculpture. And he produced these reliefs that are on the building near Lawrence Hall, one focused on power and the other on heat, which is where the power and heat plant was. And in fact, down here you see a picture kind of those reliefs as they exist on the second floor level of Lawrence Hall. Fairbanks he came here without a degree and then eventually got degrees from UW and Yale. And then he went on to teach in Michigan. But before he left, he got this commission in Portland. And I didn't have this slide last year when I gave it, but there was a fireman named David Campbell who in 1911 answered a 4-alarm fire in the warehouse section of Portland. And he was worried that all of his men hadn't got out of the warehouse. And he went inside to make sure, and immediately the building collapsed on him and he died. And so it was a tragic death. But Fairbanks was hired to do this memorial. And it's a beautiful bronze memorial. It stands in this little alcove on this funny triangular street on 18th and Burnside. So the next time you're in Portland, near Powell's or whatever, if you want to see this, it's a beautiful piece, but it's on this funny, Portland doesn't have too many little tiny triangular streets, a few of them, but this is a little corner, and it's all built basically for the monument to this fireman. Well, he was an interesting fellow. His older brother, actually, who claims to have taught him to sculpt, became the art department head of Oregon State University and started their art department. So that was another, because Fairbanks Hall, if you go to OSU, Fairbanks Hall is the name of the building, the art department. So if you walked on campus from the west end, you might see this new installed sculpture that Jan Zach had done called Laity. Or if you walked on campus from the east end, you might see Luna, this big bronze piece by Ellen Tykson, a graduate from the sculpture program. So these are things that are just on the campus that we've added. But now our focus primarily is on this exhibition upstairs. And I'll start out with this piece down here, which is called Diving Bird by Tom Hardy. So Tom Hardy, who's 94 years old now, this is Tom when he was having a sale in his studio about 4 years ago. Tom's the one who did those the fish in the fountain downtown, the famous Park Blocks fountain. He started out, he was born in Oregon, loved the animals, raised around the countryside in a ranch, and his work was always, he said, always nature-oriented. Everything he did, even the abstract work, he always felt was nature-oriented. And his longest metal mural is on Newburgh Hall on the PSU campus. It's 190 feet long, and it starts out from the ocean where he has starfish and crab and this octopus, and then it goes to the mountains of eastern Oregon where he has the Three Sisters and others. And we have a piece on campus, these flying birds that are on Lawrence Hall, the side of Lawrence Hall, and then this is the piece called Diving Bird that he did. So a lot of his work is, was animal or nature formed related, but it also abstracted it to a variety of ways. And he, like so many sculptors and many artists, have an interest in sort of two major subjects, sort of science and nature, as well as art and sculpture. Another one of the pieces up there, which is kind of a curious one, is this sculpture by Morris Graves. Now, we think of Morris Graves really as a painter and doing printmaking and drawing. We have many of his pages in the library's or the museum's collection. But Morris Graves also did some sculpture, and this is called Instruments for Celestial Navigation, number 2. Kind of curious, and this ends up being the first piece of sculpture the museum acquired in these contemporary pieces in the 60s. Well, in my research, I found out, of course, he was born in Fox Valley, Oregon, which is over east of Salem, and his family had moved from Seattle and decided to homestead in Oregon. And that didn't work out too well, and so they moved back to Washington. But he didn't graduate from high school. He and his brother decided to take a steamship become steamship hands and travel around Asia, which was very influential to him, especially Japan. And then eventually he gets his high school degree in Texas, travels to New York City, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and is in a show in 1942 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called 18 Artists from 9 States. Well, he'd been sort of invisible during World War II, and he'd applied for conscientious objector, but until this show, the Army really didn't know where he was, and suddenly the military says, oh, we've been looking for you, and so they arrest him and put him in a stockade in California for about a year till they finally release him in 43. But he then goes back to, he spends time in Northern California as well as, Northern California, Washington, and Oregon, but eventually he goes to Ireland in the 60s, and it is in Ireland that he's fascinated by the night sky, and he's totally inspired by what he sees, and so he does this series of sculptures that all are based on, they have stone and then brass and then stone bases and then a little tiny opening to look through at the sky, and so that's how that came about. So it was from his time in Ireland. Now, Paul Buckner, of course, one of the sculpture faculty at U of O, we always had generally 2 sculpture faculty, one in figurative work and one in more abstract work. Paul was the figurative sculptor. In fact, he was Ellen Tykeson's teacher. And Paul, this is the piece we have by Paul, this beautiful wood piece. He loved wood. Almost all of his work is in wood, although he did do cast work. And then this is a piano key that he carved in the scrimshaw technique, where we carved this female figure and then put ink in the grooves and then rubbed it clean. He asked one of his students, because he didn't know how to use computers, he asked a student if he could find a piano key on eBay, and he was able to locate one for him to work. This is a part of the 14 Stations of the Cross that he did at St. Mary's Episcopal Church on 13th there off of Willamette, and if you wanted to see those, I encourage you to. They're really quite beautiful. This is in the Salem Library, and this is at Mount Angel. This is the young Jesus in the dormitories at Mount Angel. Jan Zach, the other teacher we had for years, Jan came from Czechoslovakia and got involved in a lot of sculpture work, and as many sculptors, they drew a lot too, so they're always interested in form, and their drawings often are interesting compared to other people's drawings. They're looking for the form, or they're looking for the space in between things, because again, in their sculpture, they're going to have to pay attention to the negative space as well as the massive forms. These are the two of the pieces that we have of Jan's in the exhibit, one in wood and then one in cast materials. Now, Jan's great dream, as I mentioned, was a year ago, was to have a symposium. So in 1974, he brought 6 artists from around the country to produce work, and so much of the work you see around Eugene in various locations in parks and on LCC campus was done during that symposium, and that was a major event. Then now I go to more of the people. Hilda Morris. Hilda was interested in dance and music and gesture. And one of the things I find, again, in a lot of the sculptures, they often had a multiple interest in science or in her case, mathematics or organic structure. And nature continues to be a primary influence in the sculptures in the Northwest, no doubt, because we live and are surrounded by these incredible natural forms, both in the organic living world and in the geologic world. So these are pieces from hers. This one way over here is the one we have on display upstairs, one of her cast pieces. Bill Blix, who taught at LCC for years, has a number of sculptural pieces all over the state. This is a huge one that is in the Capitol grounds. Here's the state capitol in the background. And I think I don't know if I told you this story, but one time a citizen who was really protesting the government tried to drive his car into this sculpture, but it did more damage to the car than it did the sculpture. And so the airbags went off and he walked away, and still upset at the government, I think. So here's another shot of that sculptural piece, large welded metal. And then here's Bill Blix, a drawing by Tom Blodgett. And this is a piece we have Bill's in the show. And then this is one, if you've ever been to the convention center near the Hilton Hotel, this is another one of Bill Blix's pieces. And you can find them in many places. Another sculptor with work all over the state and all over the world really is Lee Kelly. Lee Kelly, born in McCall, Idaho, kind of world traveler, world sculptor. I actually met him for the first time in Sapporo, Japan. I happened to be speaking in Sapporo, Japan, and where they have big sculpture park, and he was there installing a piece at the end of a bridge, a new bridge that had been built. This is the piece we have in the exhibit by him, which is quite unusual. It's a lot more organic in its form than the pieces that he tends to do in his recent work, which is more geometry and more of kind of a volume geometry. But Lee Kelly is up in Portland, and this is again over by Ellen Tykson piece. This is on the U of O campus here, so this is one of the pieces we have.
Ken, where's the one that's on that lower left corner?
This one.
Yes,
Now that's, I believe that is in Portland, and
Isn't that the one that was installed at the north end of the park blocks there by the new PNCA?
you know, it might be. I think that is there are two pieces he did. They almost look like letters, calligraphic letters. You know, they have that quality, and this one may be the one that's in the at PNCA. There's so much sculpture work that is hidden kind of in various places. Of course, in Oregon, it doesn't take too long for the vegetation to sort of compete with the sculpture themselves. Now, a couple more sculptors that Mark Sponenberg, of course, a very important collector, teacher. He taught at U of O, he taught at OSU, and in fact, he endowed money at the Hallie Ford Museum, and he helped fund the installation of Jan Zock's piece that we have outside. Here's Mark, and this is a piece we have of his, and this is one of his earlier pieces. He also worked in London, Cairo, and Pakistan. He was one of the monuments men, like Gordon Gilkey. He was one of the people who worked in Europe to try to. He worked in that salt mine that is portrayed in the movie to kind of catalog and move out the artwork that the Germans had stowed there. James Washington, African American, born in Mississippi, came out west to work in the shipyards during World War II. And ended up staying, and he drew and painted from an early age. But this is a piece we have on display, is a torso with bird. This bird perched right against the side of the figure, and lived in Washington area. And they had a show at the Bellevue Art Museum in 50 years of his work in 1989. A lot of people at this time, of course, are trying to get involved in the arts community. So he met Mark Tobey and then went to Mexico, met Diego Rivera. Robert Sperry, potter, and Rudy Audio, potter. A lot of sculptors started out in ceramics because it was easy to get to. Material was available, you could fire it, and it could go from very soft to very hard. Rudy Audio ended up doing really quite large pieces that were these vessels with these animal and human figures on them. Rudy Audio, born in Montana, taught most of his life at University of Montana, Missoula, but his work is really all over the world. He did get an NEA to Finland. Robert Sperry, born in Illinois, lived in Canada, Chicago, and got his MFA in Seattle, and then for 30 years was involved there. This is the piece we have by Robert Sperry, this large jug, and then the piece we have of Rudio's is a kind of totem figure that is unusual. A lot of times the work from the early years to the later years changes quite a bit, and his was quite dramatic, and he took on almost this kind of Matisse drawing of figures. Ken Shores. Ken Shores was a student of Vic Avakian Ross. Vic was the ceramics teacher here, expert in glazes, and taught him all sorts of very technical things in glazing. This is the piece we have on display of his. And he ended up going to Portland and was involved in starting and developing Lewis and Clark's art department for 30 years. In fact, when I gave my 100-year lecture at the Portland Art Museum, two people from Lewis and Clark complained that I didn't talk enough about Ken Shores and his contribution to Lewis and Clark, so I'm trying to remedy that by mentioning that down here. But also, he was the first director of the Contemporary Crafts Gallery, which has become now called the Museum of Contemporary Crafts. In fact, they had a show a few years ago called Unpacking the Collection, which is a little bit of like the title of this show, where we're pulling things out of the collection. But this was a nice book done on people who had exhibited there, and it includes Rudy Audio and Ken Shores and Betty Phoebus. But Ken, was famous for sort of breaking away from just the solid clay and adding feathers. So often he would build these pieces here, there are feathers stuck inside here. So you have this hard, very heavy material of clay, and then suddenly these light, sort of effervescent aspects of feathers. And he was on the board at the American Crafts Council. So again, these people loved to live in Oregon, but reached out and got involved in things across the country. Lillian Pit, Pacific Northwest Native American, lived and is part of the ancestry along the Columbia River, where her relatives, ancestors had lived for 10,000 years. We have two pieces in the museum show of hers, this one that's primarily ceramics and this one that's primarily glass. The title of these, The Shadow Spirit Feeling the Moon Dust, is the title of this one, and then The Shadow Spirit Hovering Over the Moonscape is the title of this one. Now, glass, of course, has become a very big thing in the Northwest, and when the glass movement began to develop in the 60s and 70s, a place called Bullseye Glass started in Portland and became very successful producing glass for all over the country, all over the world, an amazing glass, although now they are being kind of looked at by the environmental control people because they find that the chemicals they use to get all those beautiful colors were not necessarily good to breathe, and so people are testing the soil and things around that. So watch out where you start your art foundry of the things. But anyway, some beautiful pieces, some of her pieces done in clay and glazing, and here she is with other pieces in her. George Kokis, faculty at U of O here for years, grew up in Harlem, New York, and went to Alfred University, the famous ceramic university in America, taught at Ohio University, and then came to the U of O. The piece you have here of his is this beautiful ceramic piece that's sort of broken into different sections. In fact, it's called 5 Easy Pieces because it's made of 5 pieces. It was made in 1970, which so happens to coincide with the movie that came out with, who is it? Jack Nicholson, right, called 5 Easy Pieces. So here's George just a year ago when he was showing some work to Bob Winger in a retrospective that they had at the White Lotus Gallery of his work. And here's George working on a piece over here. Manuel Lopez, famous sculptor in Portland, born in Spain, lived in France, came to the USA in 1942. He went to school at the Portland Museum Art School, as the Pacific Northwest College of Art was called in those days, and then he taught there for 46 years. That's a real significant time. A book and an exhibit on his work was put together by Roger Hall from Salem. This is the cover title of it, which is a piece kind of reflective of the one that you have on display here. And then this is another piece that we have of his. His work, again, primarily cast bronze, other materials, really, again, in public places all over the country. Betty Phoebus here and Keith Isthmus over there. Betty Phoebus, born in Washington but traveled to New York to study and then ended up in Pendleton. She married a doctor and worked out of Pendleton, kind of somewhat in isolation, but exhibiting really back in New York and around the country. And I lived in Eastern Oregon for a while. I met her several times. She came to do some workshops for me and then at Boise State for John Takahara. And she was very influenced by local materials. She tried to use local clays, local glazes, and also very influenced by the Cubist movement. And so a lot of her work involves figures, or what looks like groups of figures, but really abstracted. And here you have a kind of a close-up of, a face in the top of these tall things. So these are done with slabs. Usually she worked with slabs. She loved to work with slabs. When she did a demonstration, again, she would primarily lay out pieces of clay, let them dry till they became stiff, then stand them up, and then begin to join them together. Keith Isthmus, a sculptor in the Washington area, expanded out and has gotten quite involved in writing, wrote 3 Western novels, as well as doing a sculpture. This is the piece we have of his, this sort of gestural female figure. This is one I found in reference. The internet's quite a wonderful place to do research for these kinds of things. And so Christine Bordet, Christine's from Portland, and she started out as a painter, but found it frustrating because the things she wanted to do in her painting, she couldn't put enough space in the painting. And she was often dealing with figures, so it's natural she began to choose sculpture. Here's one of her sculptural pieces with these standing clay figures. The piece she has here is made of wood with a chrome paint on it, hanging from this circular piece, and it's every other piece is or every piece has a figure attached to it at some point. She says a lot of her work is people and relationships together. She says one of her pieces was called Time Flies, a sequence hurrying, swarming, flying, and time-related images. And then she says the paradox, what interests her the most in her work is the paradox of the human condition. It's ornery, goofy, illogic, and the fact that we are all in this together. And this was some of her work on the cover of Sculpture magazine a few years ago. Judith Parks and Fox. For a while she was in Eugene. Her husband, Tom Fox, taught here, taught painting for a while. She's up in Portland and a fiber artist doing these amazingly colorful pieces. The one we have here is one of her three-dimensional pieces. And so much of her work now is more wall hanging pieces, but we have this one of various interactions in it. Trained at Cranbrook and Portland. Leroy Setsall, another wood artist in Oregon, born in Pennsylvania, grew up in New York and Illinois art school. His father was a minister, and then he became a minister for a while. Was an army chaplain in the South Pacific, and then moves out to the Northwest. His wife got a position out here, and he continued to do sculpture. He tended to work with a grid all the time, almost always dealing with the grid and then variations on that grid. And this was a theme throughout the Cubist movement, was sort of a grid and then shifting centers of a grid, or taking the grid and then moving it. It's a common underlying structure in so much of painting in the 20th century. It was this sort of grid or breaking away from it. Here's one of his pieces installed in a entryway in a building. So he did a lot of architectural pieces. Cynthia Laity and her pieces, the two you have, one of them involves a photograph. She does a lot of this multimedia, combined media. Photograph starts out with a woman with a cat on the lap, and then the legs are clay on a wooden piece. This one's a woman cast, but the head is almost the head of a cat kind of a thing. And so she worked at Pilchuck. Pilchuck is the famous glass school north of Seattle. Became world famous in the 70s and 80s with artists from all over the world coming and working there. Mel Katz just had a huge show at the Hallie Ford Museum. It's interesting when you see his work to know that his father was a tailor and pattern maker. And so you see, growing up, he probably could have seen patterns not unlike this lying on a table, which might have to do with some complex piece of fabric. But we're so influenced by many of these things that work their way into our subconscious and our knowledge. James Lee Hanson, Tacoma and Portland, cast pieces with, again, these sort of animal-like figure forms. In fact, he has a number of them kind of based on horse and four-legged creature forms. So Mel born in New York, went to Cooper Union, and some of you may know about Cooper Union. It was started by this man named Cooper who became a multimillionaire and bought land in downtown New York that became real estate that skyscrapers were built on. And Cooper Union is one of the few four-year architecture engineering schools in America that has no tuition. It's completely funded by the rent from these buildings in downtown New York. However, it's extremely competitive to get into it. And I got a chance to visit through there when I was there at one time. So Philip McCracken here and Michael Gwinnett, we have this piece by Philip McCracken, and this is another one of his pieces. You can see the highly refined sort of bird-like shapes that he worked with. Michael was a potter, studied pottery in Salem, in the Salem area, Monmouth. No, in Oregon, right. And but he lived in Salem for a while, and then ran a gallery for years in Bend. And then in recent years has been doing these large clay murals, where he's working with clay and working in these large sort of almost relief forms of clay. Now, to jump to people who were alumni of U of O, I have got a few slides of that. And this is a piece by Kenneth Nelson, who was a student here, born in Pendleton. His dad had a drugstore there. and then he went on to U of O and Black Mountain, and then New York, where he lives today. He's the one that helped bring Buckminster Fuller here, because he was one of Jack Wilkinson's students. He studied with Albers at Black Mountain, and this is one of his tensegrity pieces. His pieces were, again, he was interested in another one of these art and science kind of minds. He was fascinated with structure, and he worked with Buckminster Fuller at Black Mountain. And Fuller talked about a structure that would not have any solid members touching, but would be held in tension between wire members. And so Kenneth was the first to take that concept and actually realize it, and he began to make a whole career. His whole life has been doing sculpture like this all over the world, where this whole piece is made up of many individual beams that are not touching each other. They're all held together with the tension between the ends of those beams being held together with wires. It's kind of mind-baffling to see it. This is a piece that's at the Portland Art Museum in their contemporary section. Devon Field was one of our graduates he came from New Zealand to do graduate work here, and Devon is a studio up in Portland, has been very successful in public art pieces. If you drive across the new bridge going over the Willamette River, there's a huge piece at both ends, kind of in dedication to the Kalapuya Indians and the basketry that they made. This is one of the pieces that he did in Inner Mongolia. He's done pieces in Salem, Beaverton, Sweden. In fact, in Sweden, they had him take apart a jet plane to make a peace memorial. And then in China, he was in charge. He was the organizer of the sculpture park at the One World Dream Beijing Olympics at the Bird Nest. And then here's one of his pieces in South Korea. And then here's a large piece at LCC's campus, a very highly polished chrome piece that as you leave from the way the buses leave or the cars leave, you'll see it there. And he has a piece going into Springfield. Actually, he's been very prolific. And so we're back to the exhibit. So that's my quick tour through the exhibit that you can see upstairs and some of the people in it. And I'll take any questions if you have or any, yes?
Yeah, I noticed, I think when you were on Jan Zach, there was some of his work on the exterior of the old City Hall.
Right.
What became of that?
Well, most of the work that could be preserved was preserved from the City Hall and will probably be reinstalled in the new City Hall whenever that gets built. It looks like Whole Foods has got a kind of a jump on the building in that area, because every time I drive by, there's another structure on Whole Foods, and I look over to the City Hall and it's still flat. So
That was preserved, though.
yeah, they made an effort to preserve as much art as they could. In fact, their biggest challenge, well, some of it was the sculpture, but if they could remove it, they were able to preserve it. Andy Vincent had there was a 50-foot mural that he had painted that we always saw behind the city council, and they preserved that. And in fact, his niece just got a hold of me, and she has a photograph of Andy painting that. In fact, I'm getting to become kind of a historian for the art department. It wasn't a suit of clothes I necessarily was trying on, but somehow it sort of happened that I'm doing this. But it is a lot of fun because it's a very interesting history, and for most of us, we don't really have much of the contact with that because we're all so busy, in our own time and then moving forward. That's the way life goes. So, but art history is fun. It's not as much fun as making art, I've decided, but it is fun to kind of go back and sort of see where these people came from and how they came up with these different forms and the work that they were doing. And it's a really, I always loved art history. It was a fascinating thing. I never agreed all the time with my art historians because being an artist, I thought, well, I don't think the artist was really thinking of that. And, I would have different ways of looking at it. And then it was surprising because I got involved in experimental film. When I walked into a seminar by one of the film teachers, Gene Cutler was doing one on experimental film, and he was showing one of my films and talking about what it meant and what my intentions were. And I didn't want to interrupt, it didn't, but maybe 50% was accurate. But again, we can't stop our minds from making sense out of these things and trying to piece things together. Other questions or questions you have? Yes?
So the walnut piece by Buckner, if I'm saying that name right, Buckner.
Oh, by Buckner. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I like to sit on the floor to see that piece and look up at that face. And you can see more of the details that went And that face is lovely. But it looks
Now,
like
which one are you talking about now?
the one
Oh, this one, yeah, this one, the one in the show.
Yeah, and when you sit on the floor, there are details in there that looks like it might have been pieced.
Oh, yeah, right. In fact, this was a typical thing that wood sculptors would do. Well, in the old days, you know, a lot of times a sculpture would be made out of a material and then painted or covered with a surface. And so there would be lots of patching and all sorts of things being done that you would never see. But it got to be a style, really, in contemporary wood sculpture to show the different patches or the different pieces. This is a piece in Salem, and here is a piece of wood that goes right across part of the cheek. And if you look at this, it's got all sorts of places where things have been cut out and then wood has been put in. So it's kind of been spliced together. And you're right that a lot of times, even in stone sculpture, you'll look at some of the Roman things where the arm, you know, was actually made of 3 pieces, and it looks to us like it's all one piece, but they actually very carefully put in metal pieces and dowels. And then a lot of the stone sculpture was painted. In fact, that's one of the things that's over the years, the paint's all, so we see all this Roman sculpture and we think, oh, that's just really great, but then we see the reproduction of it from a historic point of view, and it looks so god-awful ugly with all of the paint on it, you know, and you think, how could they really have liked that? And well, it's like, you know, you go travel in Italy and you'll see these beautiful old buildings and these beautiful walls, and then you realize that that's not the way they were originally. They originally had maybe marble on them, or they were sort of, you know, very, very nice, and but we've fallen in love with that kind of ancient look. Now, I don't know if you can see it in this one here, but, and I think I might have, I'm not sure if I have, other view. Yeah, I do have several views of this, but in several of them you can actually see this splicing. So in wood sculpture, that was seen as kind of it was okay to show your process. Because, well, when I went to school in the 60s, that was very much a theme, was let your process be visible, rather than having everything so slick and smooth that nobody could tell it was touched by human hands, but have the process by which things came about visible.
It looks a little wild, almost girl-like.
Yes, yeah.
And I was giving it that credit at first, but part of me knew better.
Well, you know, he even kept the surface texture of the carving tool on it, so that you can feel how he could have carved that to where it was smooth. Now, here's another piece. This is he did a dual piece of the Indian maiden and child and the pioneer woman and child. And they're up at Mount Hood Lodge, Timberline Lodge. And here's a case where that's all in wood, but that's all been smooth. I mean, you know, the carving marks are no longer visible. I mean, you can, he's tried to use carving texture that, because he's trying to duplicate boots or you know, some footing and legging and the folds, he's very careful to not let the sculpture or the tool marks show in there. While in other cases, he doesn't mind the tool marks being a part of it. These pieces in the Episcopal Church are only a foot. They're only a foot by a foot. They're very small. And so in them, it's very interesting to see he's working with a very small carving tool to try to achieve that. And but in most cases, there's, I mean, he was amazing with sandpaper, what he could do with sandpaper. One time he was talking about how that you have to have sharp tools to work in carving. And he was talking about different ways of sharpening tools, and he taught that to students. In fact, that was very much a part of all of our education, was how to make our own tools. In fact, a lot of times we were taught the tools that you buy really are not that good a quality. You can make better tools. But he was talking about how with sandpaper, you could sharpen any tool. I mean, we think of sharpening tools with a grinding stone or whatever, but he could take sandpaper and use that to sharpen any tool. And he had a lot of sayings. When he died in 2014, we had a memorial, and there were many different sayings that he had, and people would come up with them. And one of them was where the students were complaining one time about how complex and how difficult this sculpture was, you know, the processes that go through and the mold making and the casting. And Paul said, he says, if sculpture was easy, the painters would be in here doing it, you know. And because, of course, we all know painting, you know, the technique, that's why painting has persisted throughout the history of man, because its techniques are so simple and direct in that. In fact, when I was department head, I had mother asked me if we still taught painting now that computers were coming in and kind of taking over. I said, you mean that technique where you take an old wooden stick and you tie some animal hair around the end and you dip it in some goo? Yes, we still teach painting, in the art department. But again, the thing is, it's the mind. It's the mind that's making these things. It's the mind controlling the hands and the muscles, working with the eye to try to achieve these things. This one is a full standing. In fact, I took this picture kind of at a little bit, maybe at eye level, but it was on a podium, so it's as tall as I am, a full figure. And he's inlaid some ceramic on either side, almost like vestments, and probably related to Catholic orders or orders of the church.
At Mount Angel?
And this is at Mount Angel, right. This one's not visible unless you ask permission from the home there, or the retreat. There's a retreat center there to see it. And this is he did a number of awards. This is for the Fraunmeyer Award given out by the Law School for Public Service and things of that nature. Any other questions that you have? Yes?
Yes, you mentioned that Morris Graves is mostly known as a painter.
Yeah.
But obviously he was a sculptor too because he was excluded again. But was his sculpture work limited to a particular period in his life, or was it a continuing concern of his?
I don't know if he did sculpture throughout because this sort of period seemed kind of unique. And in fact, he disassembled almost all of those and didn't exhibit them for a number of years, almost I think it was almost 20 years, because people didn't know what to do with them. But I don't recall running across many other pieces of sculpture. Let me just for a minute go back to that slide of Morris Graves, because that's an interesting one. Let's see now here if I can.
I can kind of jump in on that too while you're looking for that. He didn't do much sculpture. At the time when he was doing those, he was in Ireland. He had made friends with people who had connections to NASA. So along with living out in the Irish countryside and being inspired by lights that he wasn't able to see when he had been, not that he lived in Seattle proper, he was in the country in Seattle, as far away from people in the cities as he could then too, but it was just a different sky. And then meeting people who were actually working with this new space program, he was very inspired by that. For a time, it sounded like he was considered one of these artists who they might use as this program that was coming into this idea of, we should put art on spacecraft, we should find the art in space, and he's one of the artists that was on that short list, and it never happened, I think, because of funding and what was practical for the program. But he kind of abandoned sculptural ideas because, in part, too, the cost of materials, as someone who often went through money troubles.
He became quite interested in houses and sort of
Yes,
architecture.
design,
as well.
aesthetic,
And now I understand his residency is available for artists to come and use for certain lengths of time. It's kind of like become an artist colony. I mean, it's not really a colony like where there are a number of artists, but I met with I think it was Nancy Pobans that just was down there. But he's done so much. I mean, hundreds. You have many drawings in your collection by him. In fact, these are actually Roger Sadek's. Roger Sadek bought a portfolio of sketchbook pages, and I show them in my sketchbook workshops. As many of you know, I teach sketchbooking in that. And this is a funny one because this is actually a drawing where he ran out of paper, and he did the head of the cow on another sheet of paper, and he drew these little lines here to line it up so he could he put that paper under there. So that means he started this drawing from the hindquarters. And this happens a lot of times in art. You say, I'm going to have room to do this whole tree or this whole building, and you start and suddenly you run out of room. Well, a lot of times artists will tape on or glue another piece of paper, but this was curious. So this exists on two different pages or two different parts of this sketchbook, but where he's taken this one and attached it. Then this one I thought was interesting because it's so analytical, and we don't think of an artist as being so verbal, but here you've got all these notes about color and shape and things of that nature. And then here he is in one of the photographs. I think I'm not sure if this is by Imogen Cunningham, but in his sort of Zen spiritual mode, And then you have, again, this tremendous number of birds that he used. This was a picture I found of him as a young man, and I thought this was a very curious piece that was here, because I wondered if that was another sculpture by him, because it sort of, it might fit in the kind of scale and shapes that he was working in, but like you said, I couldn't find other references.
I think if he was ever experimenting with other sculptures or putting materials together, it sounds like sometimes it was just for his own interest in his own home. He did a lot of furniture designs that then materialized into.
Well, yeah, this looks like furniture,
So
pieces of.
Down, might not ever know.
Yeah.
He wasn't writing letters or documenting in some way. He certainly wasn't showing it in galleries, so that history could be sort of hidden history of how much time he actually spent beyond his celestial.
So it turns out that his parents had a paint shop and a newspaper or a wallpaper shop in Seattle, quite successful. And they lost most of their money coming down to Oregon and trying to make this homestead run during a series of winters that was rainy and snow and cold. And they were up the San Am a little ways. Probably would have been better to build towards the coast if they had done it. But he was born during that time. He had, like, I think 7 brothers and sisters. It was a pretty large family. But this, no doubt, getting away from the family was part of his going on this steamship journey with, which again, some of these stories are not unlike the stories we hear of artists during the 60s and 70s and that. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I'm curious why a piece of Tyson's work wasn't included in this exhibit. Her work seems rather astounding to me. Upstairs.
Yeah, it was from the collection. So the pieces were drawn from the collection that they had in the collection. That's the, rather than, yeah, I mean, as I was putting this together, I thought, gee, I could put in so many more pieces to talk about contemporary sculpture or work by people that are in Oregon. I mean, right? It's a huge thing to try to put my arms around, and that's why I just show a few slides there of some alumni. Yes.
I just wanted to point out that we do have a work by Ellen Tyson at the bottom of the south stairwell. Are you familiar with it?
Oh, good.
It's a sculpture of Gertrude Bass Warner.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. On that curved arch, right?
Ellen did that one.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a.
So it's permanently installed there, so they would not be taken back to.
I wish it were out front. I'm a Luddite. I wish it was still out front.
Oh, wow.
Well, speaking about front, there is this beautiful Indian maiden and deer piece that for years was out in the front of the sculpture. And again, then there's the sculpture by Bach in the courtyard there that we have within here. And there's lots of important sculpture around, and I had to resist. I put those slides in, and then I took them out, and I thought, well, I got to keep this to under an hour because I know you guys have to get your sleep, and and it's been a long day. By the way, I want to introduce. This is Jill, the director of the museum, and she's sitting back there. And Jill, I got both Andy Vincent's nephew and Dosh, Roswell Dosh, has a whole bunch of sculpture and a whole bunch of things. And at some time I wanted to talk to you because he wondered, because we have some of Dosh's work, whether we would want some of these drawings or other sorts of things. And I know this is a complex kind of thing that I'm sure that at least once a week you get somebody contacting you about their distant relative that that left them with some plaster casts they would love to, they were sure you want. Oh, so pass the buck on to Danielle. Yeah, right, okay. Who's the Northwest? That's right. She's the Northwest curator, so that's what I should talk to. Okay. All right, good. Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak again and talk about this fascinating subject of the sculpture, and please do see it if you haven't, and look at the sculpture. In the courtyard, there's wonderful sculpture on all of the capitals, and the fellow that did the sculpture, in fact, one more slide before I conclude. I didn't get to this slide, but there are 2 pans in the sculpture, or in the courtyard, that, I'll you forced me to, so I'll show you a few more slides. So here's Laura Alpert and one of her marble pieces done with a chainsaw, actually, that cuts marble. And then Amanda Wojink's piece that looks like calligraphic pieces. This was actually purchased by the Portland Art Museum. It's now up there in the Portland Art Museum. And then this is Michael Salter, and his Styrobot sculpture. And today, sculpture has become installation. I mean, this is another thing that sculpture has become an environment that you walk into. And so he's created all these little tiny robots out of styrofoam, and then this huge, gigantic styrofoam robot. And Michael Salter is one of the current faculty. Also, unusual materials, like styrofoam. My goodness.
He must be the artist who did that wonderful, was it a shot? Yes. Remember that one?
Oh, okay. Now, this is the fellow, now, in the garden, in the courtyard there are two pans. And Noel Zane's son, who was my gardener, modeled for one of those pans, he's told me. But this was the fellow who did that sculpture, Barrett, Oliver Barrett, and this is him working on Paul Bunyan and the ox, Babe. And, but he was, I gave this lecture, as I gave it over the course of a year. People would ask me questions like, who did those pans out there? Well, I didn't know. I hadn't done that part of research for. So I went back and found a photograph of the fellow who did those pans, and I added that to the lecture. So you guys only got a partial lecture here a year ago. So you have to keep asking me back about every 2 years. I'll add a bunch more slides. Although I keep trying to keep it to an hour, but I pack more things into the slides. So anyway.
Historian.
Yeah, here. So yeah, and I love to do these sort of. I love to saturate you with pictures of artists from the past, and so that's where they come from. Anyway, thank you very much for coming tonight.